The problem with the birth control pill. If you are a listener to this podcast, it's probably no surprise to you that the birth control pill is a problem. But have you ever thought about the economic ramifications of the pill on society? Today on the Fearless Future podcast, ramifications of the pill on society. Today on Let's try that again. Let's try that again. Let's try that again. All right, we're going to try that whole thing again. All right, pretend that didn't happen. A big echo of myself. We're going to try that one more time. Have you ever been curious about the economic ramifications of the birth control pill? If you are a longtime listener of this podcast or a fan of the Guiding Star Project, you probably are in agreement with us that the birth control pill is a problem. But today on the Fearless Future podcast, we're going to unpack the economic ramifications of the birth control pill with our very special guest, Dr. Catherine Pakaluk. If you have ever been curious about the intersection or the overlap of family, of health, of economics, and society well-being, today's podcast is for you. That's what's coming up today on the Fearless Future podcast, presented by the Guiding Star Project.
Welcome to the Fearless Future podcast, where your hosts, Lisa Canning and Leah Jacobson, will explore what the world would look like if women didn't fear pregnancy. Through education, community, and healthcare solutions, Guiding Star Project strives to make this a reality at our physical centers across the United States. Join us.
Leah Jacobson, I'm bringing you down here to the screen. How are you, Leah?
I'm good. I'm really good today. How are you today, Lisa?
I'm wonderful. I am in a brand new space. I have just moved to a lovely little bigger space for my family of 10 kids, and I'm very excited. Leah, you've been off for a couple of weeks, enjoying some holidays and some downtime. How have you been?
Great. We were out camping all weekend with my extended family, my siblings, my parents. Got lots of sun, had tornado sirens going off in the tent. You know, those are sort of life experiences that you just are good for your kids.
You were in a tent and you got a tornado warning. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You know, that is one. I lived in Florida for 3 years. That is one thing I do not miss about Florida, the tornado and the hurricane preparedness. Oh, my word. Well, listen, Leah, we've got like a massive topic today. I am so excited to unpack this. Dr. Catherine Pakaluk is a very recognized name in this field. She's written a beautiful brand new book, Hannah's Children, where she is highlighting why some women might choose to have a lot of children. But she's also done a significant amount of work and made a big contribution in the area of birth control and its impact on society. Leah, when we're talking about a fearless future where we want women to not fear pregnancy, why do we have to have conversations about the birth control pill?
Well, we've talked about this so many times, Lisa, about how it's just this like insidious subconscious expectation that women will go on the pill because your body is somehow going to betray you. It's going to steal your happiness and your future. Your fertility is this massive burden. And the pill is the only thing that's going to assure your autonomy and your individualism. And so this is a massive risk to us if we want to have authentic, really freedom, is that we're able to understand and work and live with our bodies, our female bodies. So I've been listening to this book and I'm just, thrilled to be talking with Dr. Pakaluk in a little bit, because I think you and I are those women that this book talks about, you with your 10, me with my 7. I think these were my people. I was listening and I was like, let's dive into this.
Oh my goodness. Alrighty. Well, without further delay, welcome to the Fearless Future podcast, Dr. Catherine Pakaluk. Dr. Catherine, How are you?
Hi, great to see you guys.
This, honestly, the three of us on one screen gives me so much happiness. We have 31 children, I think, between, did I do that math?
That cannot be right. Wait, how many do you have, Dr. Pakaluk? You have 8?
I have 8, yeah.
8 plus 7 plus
25.
me. 25. We have 25 children between us, and that just makes me so happy. Dr. Catherine, for anyone who might not be familiar with you and your work, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I like to say first, I'm a wife and a mother. I live in the a greater DC area, and my husband and I are both professors at Catholic University of America, which is right in Washington, DC. We live in Maryland, right outside the district. And I've been writing and researching things related to the women's labor market as an economist for 10, 15 years since I finished my doctoral work in economics. And at the university, I teach courses in economics, but also in family studies and demography.
Love
Beautiful.
it.
We're so grateful that you are here. Many people listening to our podcast are health conscious, health minded. They might be
Mhm.
in the field of fertility awareness, NAPRO technology. And so the
Yeah.
health ramifications of the birth
Mhm.
control pill, I think we're all in agreement. But
Yeah.
what you have done a lot of work and contributed it to the conversation on is the economic implications. So, can you just set the
Yeah.
stage for us a little bit? If somebody hears these words, economics and birth control, and might be like, well, what do
Mhm.
those have to do with each other? Can you just set the stage a little bit about why this is an important conversation?
Sure. Sure. Okay. So basically, the biggest reason why the birth control pill is an economic question of study is because it tremendously changes the women's labor market in the 20th century. It is the major inflection point. It's big enough that we speak now about the industrial revolution. Everybody kind of gets it. Like this is this watershed moment in economic history where, instead of people kind of mostly clustered up in rural farm communities, people move to cities, they go to work in factories. We learn how to make things faster and then cheaper. And right. So then we're still here 150 years later trying to fully unpack the impact of the Industrial Revolution. Okay. So some demographers right away back in the 1970s called the birth control pill the contraceptive revolution.
Mm.
And that's a really good way to think about it. You have to think about it as having that type of effect on the labor market. Oh, specifically how? Well, it's pretty simple, right? So what the pill does, because it's not just effective at preventing births, and more effective than any other type of reversible, contraceptive, but it's reversible, right? So we have to think it's reversible, or, what we mean there is, like, you can use it for a little while and then stop using it. So there's plenty of reversible ways uh, that women and men tried to avoid births before that. Birth control isn't new. It's been around as long as people have been around. People have tried to limit births for different reasons, but it is the first tremendously effective and also reversible form of contraception. So it arrives, and then of course it has all these other things. Like it feels like it's not really a contraceptive because it's like something that you take apart from the marital bedroom. So like it sort of seems like you take your vitamin in the morning, you get your vitamin D and your pill. It almost is like you're not doing a thing. So it feels like culturally, habitually really different. It feels like something that it's meant to be for a lot of people. That's kind of how it seems. Like it's part of progress, right? Okay, so what this does is in 1960, it's generally becomes something that's diffused into the women's market in the United States. There's a little bit of intrigue there as to how it spreads around. It diffuses incredibly rapidly. So when we think about a new technology, like think about like electric vehicles today, like how long will we look back and we'll say, oh, it took, 25 years for them to reach, 80% of people. You think about that. The pill reaches the majority of women like in under a decade. It's really fast. It's really swift. We know that unmarried women had, you know, virtually unrestricted access, even though it wasn't like approved and always legal in every state in the United States. Sorry. So basically that's the way to think about this. Thing arrives and it's just this enormous impact. And so when I say the impact on the women's labor market, if you watch, and I didn't bring slides, I should have thought about it. But if you look at what we call women's labor force participation, the percentage of women of working age who aren't in school, who are interested, who are either working in the labor market, the paid labor force, or looking for a job. that number begins to surge from, in the low 20s, 25%. In the early 1960s, it surges all the way up into the mid 60s today, maybe up in the high 60s. So it begins this tremendous, we'll say, inflection point of not just women into the labor force, but mothers into the labor force. Because right prior to effective reversible contraception, like the pill, prior to that, it was difficult for women to commit to long-term projects if they were also married, right?
Yeah. Yep.
By projects, I can mean anything. Like you sign up for a course of study at a college or a graduate school, or you commit to work in a job for a couple of years, right? It was much, much harder for people to plan the timing of their births.
It's so fascinating, Dr. Pakaluk.
Mm.
I write a lot about in my own book, Betty Friedan's,
Mhm.
the feminine mystique, when that hit the market and how that was just this explosive idea of our creativity is being stifled, in the home, that
Yeah,
homemaking is a dangerous profession for women,
yeah.
that motherhood is somehow going to steal who you are, the person who you are.
Mhm.
But it's understanding it's that convergence of, like you're saying, the pill at that exact moment that
Yeah,
propelled not only this ideology, but made it possible for women
right,
to buy that.
right. Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say economists talk about this in a really clinical way and not a medical clinical way, but sort of like it's like a technology, and we can just look at this like, um, we can look at the impact of the automobile on, not just the things that you would think, like how long does it take, like you can live farther away from your work when there's an automobile. For instance, you could think about those things, but then you start to think about these sort of secondary and tertiary effects of the automobile, like where do you build new homes? Like, okay, the suburbanization of America comes around because of the automobile. And that's, in some ways good, but it also brings some downsides. There's always these trade-offs, right? But, initially people don't think like, oh, we're going to have this technology and all of a sudden it's going to change the way people live, right? And then what's the upshot of suburbanization? Well, all of a sudden people are building neighborhoods that you can't walk around in.
Mhm.
It's like
Mhm.
then 30 years later, you're going, huh, how did we become the sort of people? We don't know our neighbors. You can't walk to the grocery store. We're gaining weight because we have these sedentary lifestyles. We never walk any place. And, now there's, different steps people are taking to build more humane ways of living. But it's just a fascinating thing. You think, okay, here's a technology that's designed to do one thing, but it has all of these, secondary, tertiary, and so forth effects. And some of them can be really quite magnificent, right? Like very,
Yeah.
very big and meaningful. And it
But
doesn't mean necessarily we want to unwind the automobile, right? But we definitely have to take seriously, like, what is it doing to the way we live?
yeah,
Right?
so
And I think
let's let's
the pill is
let's
like
get
this.
into some of those.
Yeah.
Exactly. Let's get into
Yeah.
some of those trade-offs, because somebody could be listening to this and be like,
Yeah.
amazing. I want women in the workforce. I want moms
Mhm.
in the workforce. What
Of course.
are the big trade-offs that have happened as a result of the pill?
Well, I can speak to sort of common sense, but I can start by just mentioning some of the things that economists have noted. I mean, or noted, like written lots of stuff about. Um, One of the biggest ones is that the shift of women into the workforce and into prior to that, even really, it's contemporaneous, a very large shift upwards in women's education, so
Yeah.
advanced education.
Yep.
Okay, but let's think about this from it. So there's a couple of papers that are interesting. One was most famous. One is called "The Power of the Pill," and it documents how really after the pill comes, what happens is you see this major increase in women going to college and going on to advanced degrees, and that makes sense for the reasons we just described.
Yep.
But you asked about trade-offs. Well, that sounds like not a trade-off. Well, two things about that. One is that people who are going to college and finishing more education, they begin to think about getting married later.
Yeah.
All right. So, what does getting married later do for women in terms of family and family formation? Well, one of the things it does is it delays the beginning of your family. Right? So, you
Yeah.
get married later and you begin childbearing later. And even if you don't change your desired family size, getting married later, of course, puts you starting your family when you're a little bit less fertile. It might mean the transition to finding a mate is harder because you're looking at a different time and a different place. So it sort of changed the shape of the marriage market a little bit. That's been well documented. It pushes marital fertility later in the life cycle, and we know it impacts marital fertility negatively. So it initiates a shift to where married couples have fewer children. And we think that's both a question of this timing, like you have them later, and also a question of a kind of displacement. Because now women are thinking, well, I've got this degree and this job, but I also have like my family. And so, balancing two things, it's harder to balance two really heavy things. So you have a few, maybe one or two less children, and you also do some work. So in other words, you're just doing both things. Okay, so that's a trade-off. Whether women are happy with that trade-off or not, that's a separate, we could talk about that in a minute. And the other trade-off that is related to this, like later, so college, advanced degrees, later marriage, later fertility for married women, is this another separate paper, which was called The Paradox of the Pill, that I helped on that paper. And that really examines like who goes to college? Is it everybody in society? So it
That's
looks
interesting.
at the yeah, so
Yeah.
it looks at the way in which actually what this did is it shifted the marriage market, especially for women at the high end of the
Mm,
of sort of life expectations. And what we mean is like really simple. Women whose dads went to college, they're more likely to go to college. And those were the women who shifted into those advanced degrees. Women whose fathers did not go to college, who had just a high school degree, those women found it more difficult to get married. They didn't go to college, they didn't shift into those advanced degrees, and then they found it much more difficult to get married. So there's a change in the mating market, which sort of starts to take place in the 1960s, and the consequence of that then is an increase in non-marital fertility. So
yeah.
women suffering that tragedy of being pregnant without a partner,
Yeah.
spouse, that occurs at the same time. So what we see this a kind of bifurcation in the lives of American women, with women who, let's just say, are more privileged, have more resources going into their lives, kind of on paper economically doing better, and women who have fewer resources and are less privileged, economically doing worse.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty big
We don't always
societal
talk
trade-off.
about that. Yeah,
Yeah,
we tend to kind of just brush that under the rug of like, no,
right,
it's choice. It's
right,
the ability to live the life you want, but we're not looking at this life is hard. This life is not an easy life. It's not
right,
a privileged life that we're saying
right.
is such yeah.
So what I'm describing here is another thing that economists have a word for, and I think everybody understands it once you put it into regular language, and that's a kind of collective action problem. So
Yeah.
collective action problem is where a whole bunch of people make decisions that you may not have made that decision, but then
Mm.
it makes it very difficult for you to depart from what everyone else is doing. And I think everybody's favorite example right now is this sort of smartphone life.
I was thinking about that when you
Yeah,
were talking about how quickly
yeah,
the pill got into
yeah.
society. I was like, I remember being a smartphone holdout in the
Yes,
early,
exactly.
not
And the
getting one.
problem is the more and more people buy into the smartphone life, the harder and harder it is. Like the more punished you are if you're the holdout,
Yeah,
right? Why? I mean, you might be holding on to some good things other people don't have. You maybe your relationships are better, your marriage is better, like you could focus during the day. But like at some point you can't unlock your car. Like which is ridiculous,
literally.
right? Right?
Yeah,
Because what happens is, all of industry, all of society begins to build these fancy things into your phone, or you can't pay at the grocery store at some
yeah,
point. It's like everything's in your phone, and so at some point, the non-adopters, the people who wouldn't want to use the pill, find like the whole thing has shifted. I got left behind. Like
yeah,
now I can't even get a date because every man expects me to have sex on the first date because every man expects me to be on the pill. And what do I even do with that? And how do I even go to a bar or go to a social event, and how do
yeah.
I know which guys out there are looking for someone like me? Can I wear a t-shirt? Can I like so these you split the mating market in ways that are really profound, and then people go, well, what do I do now? Like, do I have to go to some, like, I don't know, off the grid college to signal to potential mates that I'm the kind of person that wouldn't want to do my life this way. And in fact, that's what we're seeing, right? Like,
That's
I
what
don't
we're
know
yeah.
about your family's experiences, but my own experience is that, by and large, a very good strategy for helping your children to find good spouses is to send them to schools where they can coordinate and know that a lot of the other young people around them have a similar worldview. Much easier. You send them to the local state school here, and you're going to have that problem. Like, how do you find the kids? So that
Okay,
is a
I have to
huge problem.
pause.
Yeah,
I have
go
to
ahead.
pause. What
Yeah.
would you put on the t-shirt, Dr. Pakaluk? Like what phrase is going on the t-shirt?
And so my husband used to joke, as you see me, I'm drinking this huge bowl of coffee. I asked my son to make me a coffee before our podcast, and he made it in this bowl, which is lovely. It's this lovely old bowl, but I can't drink it with one hand, and of course, it covers my whole face. But my husband used to say, to answer your question, that he wanted a t-shirt that said, "I don't drink decaffeinated coffee and I don't use artificial contraception." So, like we can imagine a bunch of t-shirts, but yeah, it raises a great point. Like, how do you signal how do you signal in a world where the sexual norms have shifted to reflect the ubiquitousness of the pill? How do you signal in an outside world that
All
you
right.
want to do something different?
Lisa, what t-shirts have you seen recently? Because I actually did just see a t-shirt
Did you see one like that? I
Really?
have not seen one to
Did I
this
tell you
effect.
the one I just saw at the
Yeah.
National Eucharistic Congress?
What?
Yes.
It was the funniest thing I've ever seen. And I think there's probably thousands of photos of this young man online because everybody was just laughing at his shirt. He wore it every day at the Eucharistic Congress, and it had cut off sleeves. In the back of it said, "Looking for Catholic pro-life wife," in big
Yeah.
black writing. And so I think everyone snapped a picture of it and sent it to their single niece and said,
Yeah.
"Hey, do you
Yeah.
want me to give you your number?"
Oh my gosh, that's amazing. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's get into
Yeah.
this topic a little bit, the impact of men on men.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
I read in an article that you were cited in
Mhm.
that the pill expects too little of men.
Mm.
Tell us about that.
Mm. Well, I don't know which article this is, so I'll just have to take a stab at what either I meant or what the article meant. Um, yeah, so I think we have to think about so I'm going to go ahead and use these clinical words again that sociologists and economists use. Um, we tend to think of sex as something that women gatekeep, and they gatekeep it because it's a resource that men tend to demand and women tend to be more hesitant to share. The reason women are hesitant to share it, at least if we were going to take just a kind of a clinical anthropological perspective, like, is obvious, right? You don't want to share this resource unless you're coupled up with someone who's ready to provide for you and your children, right? So because women bear the consequence of being pregnant, this relates to the subject of this podcast, right? So it's something that usually, I say usually, a lot of these things are starting to look kind of alarmingly different in the world of pornography, but usually this is something that men demand access to, or when we say demand, we say they want access to, they're seeking it. And women tend to put up natural, modest barriers like, oh no, like we're not going to do that until like I know you're going to be around for life, right? And that's like a rational, good response.
Yeah.
So if women are able to turn off their fertility in a way that we just described, like just reversibly, they could take a pill, and so at this point now, men don't have to prove their worthiness as a spouse. They can buy you dinner and expect to get a nice warm night together. Whereas, in the absence of something like the pill, what happens is, you've got lots of suitors who want this resource that you have. And we can describe this in evolutionary terms, and it's nicer to describe it in sort of like how God made us terms. But you have suitors, and you need to differentiate between them. And so you want to know that you can buy me more than a dinner. I'd like to know that you actually could, support me for it. So, I would like to know who you work for. I would like to know that you're a stable employee. I would like to maybe see some of your references. Now, what does that look like? Does that look like like eHarmony or a dating service? Or does it more look like, what might have happened in the past, like the suitor has to talk to the dad or the brothers and kind of like establish some like rapport. Somebody has to heard of this person, like where did
Yeah.
he come from, and does he like what's his reputation? Because we know that people who are seeking a date or romantically interested, in a sense, they have an interest in manipulating or misrepresenting. So quite simply, really cheap, effective birth control. I mean, effective at least in terms of preventing births, lowers the bar so that the kind of the group of women kind of trying to keep this barrier up, like we're only accepting advances from really respectable, good men, like they don't have to prove as much.
Yeah.
Or that's the perception. And I don't actually believe it does effectively do this. I think that it fools us into thinking it does this. Because there is a cost to these like short-term sexual liaisons, and we know that. We know that there is a cost, and women pay that cost at a much greater price than men do. So we know that short-term casual sexual encounters are sort of more psychologically damaging to women. And whatever 45 years of feminists saying we could do it the way men do it hasn't changed that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say, Lisa, it was interesting when we were at the SEAT conference last year, and we discussed this afterwards. The number of young men who came up to our booth, we were talking a lot about the physical healthcare ramifications of the pill on women, and it was young men who cared very deeply about their girlfriends, and they're saying, how do I, as a young man, convince her that she doesn't need to be on the pill? She thinks she needs to be on the pill, and it was coming from the young men, and it was such an interesting conversation for us to have. Because we were recognizing they don't know how to, they feel their voice has been taken from them. They don't know how to talk to a girlfriend about, I said, I think you just need to be the kind of man that's trustworthy, that she doesn't feel the need to protect herself against. But it is such a strong indoctrination in these girls.
Yeah. And we have to not ignore the possibility that in a lot of young women, that's been handed to them by their mothers.
Yes.
Right. So it's not, I mean, of course, we can point to schools, we can point to culture, but in a lot of cases, they're learning that attitude from their mothers. Their mothers have they had terrible life experiences, and the moms say, look, this is how you have to handle it. And so, maybe if they're dating these sweet young men, they have to learn like a completely different approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So here at the Guiding Star Project, we have a vision for a future where no woman fears pregnancy. Anna Shepard, we see your comment here about another collective problem is that it's almost impossible to be a stay-at-home mom and afford to buy a home on one income. So that's a great observation.
Yep.
This future where no woman fears pregnancy, there's obviously a healthcare component to this. We need to provide the kind of care that will support this, life-affirming options. There's a mindset reality to it, but there's definitely an economic one. Children can cost money. They can.
Right.
As an economist, what are some things that we could do as a society if we want this to be the kind of future? So a fearless future for women to not fear pregnancy.
Yeah. Well, I think we might want to distinguish between marriage and unmarriage. The right and kind of like fullest best answer is that the economic impact of a baby on a woman's life is best handled in marriage, and marriage is the institution best suited to sort of make that something you can weather. We know this from a lot of data, but so in a sense, the question you're asking, I feel like it could be rephrased like, what can we do as a society to really bolster the institution of marriage? Because that's the whole point. Like marriage is the institution into which children have the best shot at growing up not in poverty, into which, in which women have the best shot. Again, nothing's perfect. I come from a broken marriage, but we'll say, that in terms of like looking at the averages and the statistics, marriage is that institution where women have the best shot at being well taken care of. Because it ties men to their children and creates these beautiful like incentives for men to really grow in their providership. And that's something we forget a lot. Like we look at young men or we look at men without degrees, and we forget that men, like women, they can grow in their lifetimes, and they have such a huge capacity to grow in their providership. And they really respond to the sense that like, it depends on me. Right. So yeah, I feel like your question, like it's best to focus the question on bolstering the institution of marriage. A second question, of course, and it's important to ask, is what can we do to help women brace for the financial impact who are not privileged to be married, not blessed to be married. And of course, that's going to happen all the time. And it's a huge tragedy, and something I think as Christians, we're obliged to ask how we can help. Yeah.
Well, along that line of like the collective action problem really is that, societal support for motherhood seems to have, the pill and sort of remove the obligation of society to help us care for these children because, well, it's your choice. You chose to have those kids. That's your problem. I mean, I think that's kind of a feeling those of us with a lot of kids, we probably all heard some variation of that, of like, well, you should have thought of that,
Yeah. Like it's on you. It's your choice. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Like, this is not our collective problem.
Right.
That's a problem.
Right. So I just rephrased your question, didn't really answer your question. Lisa, but yeah, I think picking up on Leah's point here, I think that's, and even the question that came in about this kind of a collective action so the economic impact on a family raising children today is, we have to admit it's been exacerbated by the fact that the norm is a 2-earner family. Certainly, in the United States, a lot of pro-family politicians like to talk about that. And they like to talk like, well, we'll fix the economy to be the sort of economy in which like you can make it with one income. And my reaction to that is like, yeah, and pigs can fly. Like, right? I mean, unless you're gonna tell people or somehow create a situation which you tell people they're not allowed to have a second income, which, I mean, now we're thinking about like super weird, backwards, tyrannical states. Like, we don't want to do that. There's not a way. There is not an economic way to put couples with a single income at an economic level playing field with couples that have 2 incomes. It's just not like, right. That's why pigs can fly. Like, it's not a thing. So if anybody's promising you they're going to fix it, and listen, like, growing the child tax credit, might be a good idea. It's not big enough to solve that problem. Right. And so as long as it is in a free society, it's possible for couples to be married and, have their 1.6 children and then double down on work, both parties. Families like ours who have, so many children that they're not doubling down on work, or they're not, at the moment seeking other sources of income, will be at a disadvantage. So it's good to just get that out of the way, because there's not a solution to that. At the moment, of course, we could talk about ways in which I think certainly in this country, I'm not as familiar with the current I've got like ideas about Canada, but I'm not like completely versed on it. But certainly in this country, we do talk a lot about what, how to shape and continue to improve the way we try to help or provide help for single parent families. However, that's always incomplete. It's always incomplete. So, so where does that leave us? At this point, I don't know if I'm answering a question or just chatting. So,
well, I think just the conversation is important here, to look at all three of us. We all are mothers of many children, and we all have some sort of paid work. It's the flexibility of the work, I think, that allows us, as a university professor, maybe you have time off in the summer, maybe. I mean, as a stay-at-home mom working, my office is here at home. Lisa, your office is at home. Like I have 6 or 7 children in my house today, like around me, like it's these more flexible situations that make it possible for us to not fear having children.
Yeah. I mean, I'm very biased. Entrepreneurship is such a, not even a passion. Like it is a passion, but it's my answer to that question.
Yeah.
How else does a family, especially a large one,
right?
How else do you compete, so to speak, or keep up with the disadvantage that you're talking about? There are people who are able to work with their one child, and just all of their resources are pooled into that. So for me, entrepreneurship has been the answer, and hence why I'm so. But it's when I always think about the agricultural
Yep.
evolution.
Yep.
Like how
Absolutely.
we made money off of our homes
Yep.
for a
Yep.
long time,
Yep.
for a very long
Yes.
time.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
it's such an interesting thing. We talked about choice and
Mhm.
how, oh, well, you had all these children. It's your choice. You should have thought
Yeah.
about that. In your brand new book, you talk about a bunch of women who have made this choice.
Mhm.
Tell us about Hannah's children, and perhaps in the context of this
Mhm.
conversation today, like what can we glean from this beautiful new book of yours?
Yeah. Well, in the context of this conversation, I think maybe a good way to place the context, and then I'll just do a couple minutes about the book, is a good question I got from one of the early readers of the book who has a great podcast called Girl Boss Interrupted. I think she might be in the process of rebanding her podcast. So, but at the moment, you can find tons of great episodes. Girl Boss Interrupted, Helen Roy. And she asked me a question, sort of like, like, who devalued family life? Like, if family life been devalued? In other words, has motherhood been devalued? And it's a common. I think a lot of people feel that way. Like, are we facing a situation where the choice to have children, whether it's one or 10, it looks we look down on it. We don't value it as much as like, oh, you're an astronaut, or oh, you went to the Olympics, or whatever. And
True.
and I struggled with the way to answer the question because, of course, I do think there are people who have specifically engaged in a devaluation. I do think that's present. But my own answer is kind of, um, I don't think that's the only story. I don't think intentional devaluation is the only story. I think the better way to think about like the thing that's occurred, and then this is related to what we just talked about and in the book. The better way to think about it is that the pill, in the context of what we talked about, it provides this option now. It's a technology that's available, provides this option for some people who would prefer to finish college, maybe go to law school, to do those things, and then imagine their life instead of with 5 or 6 kids, with like 2 kids and a law career. Okay, so it provides this option. So what happens is it changes the choice set, right? Um, what do I mean? Like, okay, I wear an Apple Watch, and I didn't want to wear one. My brother works for Apple, and I was like, oh, it's going to ruin my life. But actually, once I tried it, it wasn't as bad as I thought, and it's brought a lot of great things to my life, and we could talk about that in a totally other time period. Um, a lot of really good things, related to health and fitness for me in particular. Um, and so, well, what happened? Like, I have 2 or 3 beautiful analog watches that I used to wear all the time, and I valued and treasured, and some of them were gifts, and I haven't pitched them. But what's happened is I choose this one most of the time because I really value the thing it's brought to my life. Okay, so what I just described there is nobody devalued analog watches. Like, nobody set out to tell me that that beautiful analog watch, one of them was a gift from my husband. Nobody that right? Do you see where I'm going?
Yeah.
Nobody.
Yep.
And yet, because there's a new option on the table, and I look at this thing or I start using it, I try it out and I go, this has brought a lot. I really like what this has done for my life. Um, Now it has devalued the analog watches in my possession by comparison. And so
Yeah.
this is the kind of thing economists are really good at thinking about, is like it's a kind of choice set. Now, some people would like to say, well, harumph, like we shouldn't have this choice. And I think that's sort of like a very weird sort of wishful thinking. Um, the truth is, now think about this a little carefully, with me. The truth is, even if we didn't have the birth control pill, we would have, and this is a good thing, we would have grown in our understanding of women's cycles,
Yes.
and right, and our natural methods for spacing our children,
Yeah.
right? So even if we didn't have the pill at that moment, and we would still, I think in God's providence, we would have ways of knowing how to choose other things besides, just letting 10 kids happen to us by accident, right? Because
Yeah.
none of us in this chat, I think, we didn't have our children by accident. We didn't have our children because we don't believe in the pill. I think this is really important. This is why, as an economist and a Christian, I don't make any apologies for saying we have to look at the choice set and why people want the things that they want. Because ultimately, even if the pill hadn't come along, we could go harumph, like, I'm so mad about it, or I'm so mad about legal abortion. The demand side, like why people choose what they choose, is the vastly more important question.
Yeah.
And so what happened in the 60s, I think, it was hastened by the pill, but I really believe it would have happened anyway, as we learned, and we should have learned, right? Like God didn't want us to not know when we can get pregnant.
Exactly.
He doesn't want us to not know that. He wants us to know that. And he wants us to respond to that knowledge like in freedom and in love, and to build our lives around that beautiful capacity, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what happened was we didn't intentionally devalue. I don't think the big story is intentionally devaluing motherhood, but bringing new things to the table where people go, gosh, like I'm super good at litigating. I love litigating. I can litigate and I can protect people from people who do harms to them. Now I'm not a lawyer, I'm making this up. But like I can go out and I can sue people who damage the lives of the working poor. Like this is a huge, beautiful mission, and I really love this. I feel called to this. Okay. All right. Well, then what happens? Okay. Well, then what's happening is that we've got two things on the table, and they're both good. They're both
Mhm.
good. All right.
Yeah.
So then the question is, does it mean that nobody in the presence of a really great good, like say doing good for other people with their God-given talents, that nobody could still choose to prioritize motherhood? And that is why I wrote this book. It's like, well, actually, no, it turns out you can still prioritize motherhood and you don't have to neglect all your talents. But what does that look like? What would it look like to say, in the presence of this, what I call the new calculus? Where I say the new calculus, I just mean it's the new world where, whether it's the pill or the natural awareness we have of our cycles, we do not live in a world, nor should we want to go back to where we just don't have any idea how we get pregnant. Like this is crazy stuff. And I
Amen.
don't care if you're, Christian, Jewish, whoever, however right wing you think of yourself, it would be a terrible thing to advocate for going back to some kind of land where we're just flying blind, right? That's not our vision. It's not God's vision. So we really have to deeply examine what it is that we are led to want, where our values are, and how we prioritize those values. So, right. So, okay. So the one sentence is that we know that most women in the world, faced with this set of options now, are choosing motherhood less and less often. And so a lot of people investigate why that is. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to talk to a lot of people who did choose motherhood in spite of the fact that there are lots of other great options, and just have them tell me about the tensions and the trade-offs and how they think about it and what got them to be like, how'd they become the kind of person who'd want to have like 7 or 8 or 9 kids? Like where does that idea pop into your head? Does it happen at the beginning? Do you get married and think like, I want to have 15 kids? Or does it happen like it's a magical place like after 3? And that was the idea. So I interviewed all these women around the United States who have 5 or more children, who'd gone to college, and I just asked them really those questions, like how'd you get here, how to get started, and how's it going, and tried to then weave their stories into coherent narrative that kind of explores this background calculus of the pill and the changes in the 20th century, but kind of paints I think a picture of what it looks like to have to make these decisions. And I draw a few conclusions along the way. So,
We don't want to spoil it for anyone who hasn't
Mm.
read the book at all, but was there any finding that you thought was just like, this is the thread that goes through every story? Is there anything that you really saw?
Yeah, I guess I would, maybe the title anyway spoils it. I mean, the title is Hannah's Children, and the Hannah is the biblical Hannah. And I think that, I didn't go into this thinking about the biblical Hannah. It was the furthest thing from my mind. But a thread that really ended up speaking to me after listening to all of these interviews was the attitude of seeing children, or coming to see children, not necessarily starting out this way, coming to see children as really a divine blessing, and kind of unpacking, trying to understand what that meant. Women who are Jewish, Mormon, Catholic, Christian, Protestant, all different faiths in my study. And if I had to find like a common language, and I present you all these different ways, but that that really stood out to me. I present it as a finding because it is like I don't think so. Who's the biblical Hannah? Well, she was barren, she was infertile, and she prayed desperately to be blessed with a child. And then, of course, God sent her baby Samuel. And then she brings Samuel back to live in the service of the Lord, and it's a heartbreaking scene for anybody who is a mom, to think like you could take your one only child and bring him back and say, here, God, I promised him back to you. And then the priest of the temple says to God, like, look at that faith. We should honor that faith. And uh, I didn't know before I looked this up, but then God sends her 5 more children. So she is this amazing person who represents both I know, if you're just
I don't
asking
remember that
yourself,
part.
you didn't know this, right?
I just remember the "For this child
I
I have
know.
prayed," that famous line.
Exactly. I'm telling you, I just discovered this when I was working on writing up the manuscript. Like, at some point I thought I'm going to go back and read that story of Hannah, because she certainly represents the voice of seeing a child as a blessing. In fact, the name Hannah today, the etymology of that word over time has come to mean, he has blessed me. God has favored me with a child. And so I thought, like, okay, and then I went and looked at the story and I almost fell off my chair. I couldn't believe it.
I
So,
don't remember
so
that.
Hannah represents all of these different possible phases of womanhood. I mean, but all of them together represent, I think, this single idea that you can be open to receive a blessing, but you can't like go buy a blessing at the store, right? It's not a thing you can grasp at in the way that we might, we go shop for tomatoes or apples. So then this thing became like a challenge to unfold. Like, how do you view a blessing that's also, in a sense, out of your control, right? So Hannah, of course, shows us what it looks like to live with infertility. My very dearest friend in the world has been infertile her whole life. And these are huge crosses. And of course, absent the view that children are great blessings, we actually can't fully appreciate the sorrow of not receiving that blessing. So there's this whole intricate job of trying to present what it looks like to be open to God's providence, but also so really yearning for a child, but also kind of understanding like that these things, these matters of life and death, they're not in our control. And that once we recognize, like, merely even conceiving a child isn't in my control, I have to entrust that to God's providence. But then that leads you to the next step. If merely conceiving a child is in God's control, it makes it easier to understand this whole attitude of trust in God, where you say, oh, well, I don't fear a child, because if God sends me this child, God will provide for this child. Since God is the author of this life, God will certainly be the author of the sustenance for this child. So I started to, hearing from especially our Jewish sisters when I was out on the road, I started to think like, oh, okay, as a Catholic Christian, our Christian brothers and sisters, like, we've inherited some of this language, but we actually we didn't see, or at least I will say me, I didn't see how these threads go all the way back in the Hebrew scriptures. So this was, like, for me, the biggest finding was putting all of that together and trying to put that all together. And the book is a first pass at it. It's probably not the last thing I'll try to say about it, but I think that's that point about providence is like the piece that maybe connects most with this podcast and your themes. But it was really, it was a blessing to discover it.
Well, it's and we talk about this a lot. I mean, you were just talking about the control, and really that divine providence and that trust in God being in control versus the antithesis, which is really birth control. It's our desire to try to control. And how do you meld that when you're women who are working and very much trying to be in control in some sense of our family, of our making conscious decisions? Like, I think people tend to kind of think it's either you're completely throwing all control out the window and it's, a giverful family, or it's I'm completely controlled. And we all kind of sit in this middle weird place of I'm responsible, but yet I trust.
1,000% what you just said, 1,000%. Most people, when they hear about people like us, they think we have our large families because we rejected control. Or we rejected family planning. And of course, we rejected it in a certain way. But what does it look like to actually make a conscious decision and a decision of agency in the best sense, in the way the feminists would want female agency, right? Like I chose these children, but I didn't
Yep.
choose them the way I chose, like, my groceries. I chose them
Yeah.
in a way that has to do with cooperation with God. And so I try to describe like the language. I heard a lot of women talk about the language of readiness. Like,
Yeah.
so they wanted to be blessed with a child, but they weren't sure when they would be ready. And so then there's this process. What is that process of being ready? And I think that
That
a lot of that language of readiness is completely foreign outside of our
okay.
Yeah.
inner circle, right?
That's the t-shirt. The
That's a
t-shirt
t-shirt.
is
Yeah.
I'm ready.
I'm ready. It's so funny.
Well, but
That
this
is
the
so
thing I
funny.
don't think this is one thing I don't think many people have ever heard discussed
They've
by
never
mothers
heard it.
with
It's
family,
completely
that
off the grid. Mhm.
and I remember saying it one time to somebody, if we didn't use natural family planning, I would have 15 children. And they looked at me
Mhm.
like, you have 7
Yeah.
children. How can that not be an accident? And I'm like,
Right.
oh no, we would have more.
Yeah. Right.
If we really weren't paying attention, my
Yeah.
fertility would have been even greater than what it is.
Yeah.
Like, this was a very conscious decision, and 7 is less than what we probably would have had. So
Right.
these conversations need to happen.
Yeah. I mean, it's probably, it's too much to spend a lot of time on, but probably you guys like me were really interested in the big viral, flap about Ballerina Farm this week, Kenna Nealon,
Yes. The poor lady,
which
she nailed.
yeah, she's getting nailed. I mean, of course, she's defended herself beautifully, and I think
Yes.
lots of people have. But of course, my first thought was like, I should have interviewed her. I'm still going to work on that. But the point is that there were many interesting things in that piece, that Times piece. But one of them was that the interviewer just couldn't figure out what it meant that they pray about when they should have another child.
Yes.
Like this feature of like this feature of what it looks like to live as a married couple in a kind of dialogue with God about your capacity to bring new life into the world. It's so foreign that if a journalist from outside the community hears it, they have to assimilate it to some like broken model of like, she must feel like she has to have children.
Male domination. Yes.
Yeah, male domination and like religious control or whatever. So, I mean, I think there's a job to be done in terms of helping to explain that. I've just started. I've just cracked the beginning of it, right? Like, but yeah, I think that we can get there.
We are glad you've cracked this one open.
Mhm.
I could talk to you two ladies for the rest of the day. Literally, let's just spend 8 hours talking about this. But I have one last
You have a
question. I want both of you to answer it separately. Okay. So Leah, I'm going to come to you first, but it's for both of you. If you could both have a megaphone that reaches the entire world in the 1960s, when the birth control pill was just, the research and the development and the marketing was just rolling out, you've got a megaphone and the whole world can hear you. Leah, I'm coming to you first. What would you say?
I would have been saying, stop. There is research coming. At this moment, we're just starting to learn. Like, and that's what I always look back at and think, we were so close. Like, had the technology of natural family planning been just a little bit ahead of birth control, if we had something other than the rhythm method. And so I wish I could have just said, yeah, I know the rhythm method doesn't really work, but hang on. Like, we've got just around the corner here, we're going to have natural methods that allow us to do the same thing. Your desire to space your children is not evil. Like, you're not a bad woman if you want to work, if you want to be creative. There's a better way to do it that doesn't risk your health. Hold on, pay attention to these little known researchers. It's coming. That's what I would have said.
Dr. Pakaluk, what about you?
Yeah, well, I want to definitely echo what Leah just said. I think the other thing I probably would have, I mean, I'm just trying to transplant your question to today, and I'm thinking about some of the things I think are similar to the pill, but that are happening today. And I'm thinking, what is the pressing thing that I feel like I want to tell people all the time? And I think, honestly, a lot of times it's, there's a 2-part message, but like the more important part is sort of like double down on your spiritual life, like pray a lot, because I do think, like when you said like this is, we're so close and there's a better, like, why does it so often happen that like the thing that's toxic or unhealthy,
Yeah.
it gets there first, right? And I think that's where you have to sort of recognize that, or we see like there are spiritual forces at play,
Yes.
and those spiritual forces are really often, they're big and they're beyond our control, right?
Agree.
So when I think about today, I think like this is really a time for those of us who pray to really double down, because there are dark spiritual forces, which I don't mind saying. I mean, I don't want to put words in anybody else's mouth, but I don't mind saying it. Um, and when you see the whole medical community or the whole political community getting behind things that are new and experimental, and the pill was new and experimental in its time. It still is today, of course, but it's changed drastically. We know that those early types of hormonal birth control were pretty unhealthy for people.
Terrible.
Um, and like the new types are unhealthy in their own ways, that they're different. But yeah, like when you see the whole medical community getting behind a new technology, and we didn't properly vet it, and it's not properly, like that is a pattern that repeats. We see that a lot of times. And when you look at it, you go, but like, gosh, this looks impossible to oppose. Like everybody's behind this,
Yeah.
everybody's all in on this. It's like, okay, get your rosaries, get your, like pray more, because this probably is going to be, it's going to have I mean, this is just not how, it's not how good science and good medical science proceeds, is through caution and through like little experiments. Uh, and I think the pill is similar to some of the things we've seen recently in terms of like huge. I mean, and I don't just mean like the COVID vaccinations, which I think like it's now you're allowed to say out loud, like it was an experiment. You could be for it or against it, but it was like mandated on people and it was an experiment. But I mean, I kind of think today like Ozempic is going to be similar. It's something that, or these new medications that are aiming to help people who have real metabolic disease to reduce their weight. Again, it's not that it's wrong to try to look for these sort of medical solutions, but when you see like, oh my goodness, everybody's on board, like the elite universities, the FDA, like the politicians, the health insurers, they're all on board and they're all saying, no worries, we have only like 3 years of safety data, but it's going to be fine. And let's give this to 12-year-olds. You're like, well, okay, maybe we should exercise a little caution and restraint. So yeah, that would be sort of my thing going back to the 60s, is on the one hand pray, and on the other hand, some common sense in terms of what we put in our bodies. And
Dr. Pakaluk, I just have to say, I really want to connect with you afterwards, because I am teaching a standards of women's healthcare class next fall at the University of St.
good.
Thomas. And that is the entire point of it, is
Okay.
how do we establish standards
Yeah.
of care for women's healthcare?
Yeah.
And exactly what you just said, women's
Yeah.
healthcare has this strange fast track, and it's groupthink, and it's, well, the doctors all say it's fine.
Yeah.
Here's the standard of care. And then we look decades later and we say, we really messed that up. We really hurt women.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we know, like, there's so many funny, well, quirky features about women's health, and we know this. Like, women are less listened to when they come in and they say something hurts. These like little things, and you go like, "What do we make of that?" So, but here's a fun fact: I became an economist because I started out interested in health, women's health, and public health. And the reason I got into economics is because at some point, working in research, medical research, in late high school, early college, is I became persuaded by people I talked to that if you really want to impact health and combat bad health at a large scale, where a lot of the damage happens is in the economics and statistical world. What do I mean by that? I mean, the number one best way to improve standards of living for women and men and families is to help them grow economically. And flip that around. The number one way in which we see like things like, destructive forms of birth control exported, what's the number one justification, is they're not going to have enough economic growth. And so, of course, as a kid, you're like, well, what does that mean? Like, is it really true that like South Africa can't become a prosperous country if we don't sterilize half the population? So these two things are always connected, and it's always on women, right? It's like, well, women have to stop breeding, women have to stop getting pregnant, and then we can really have economic growth. So, this is one of the reasons I really love Lisa's work with entrepreneurship, because really there's this fundamental idea that sort of women's capacity to bear children is at odds with, it's holding us back from material prosperity. I think that's bunk. I think it's crazy.
It's bunk.
Yes,
Totally
bunk. And so this is
That's
true.
It's bunk.
True in the poorest countries, and it's true in the wealthiest countries, that the solution to this is actually to give women the tools and the support that they need to become entrepreneurs and to contribute, right?
Yeah.
So, of course, what you're doing, your women's health initiative at St. Thomas, I mean, these pieces are all together. But yeah, that's how I got into economics. I was like, well, I just want to help women have babies. And then, of course, they were like, yeah, but that's going to kill economic growth. And I went, is that true? So anyway, long story.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well,
yeah.
clearly if you ever don't want to be a professor anymore, come over to Guiding Star. We'll
You can do both.
Yes. Well, this was so much fun. You guys
Dr.
are just a
Pakaluk.
hoot. I love what you're up to.
Let's do this again soon.
Yeah.
I think we should probably do this again
100%.
soon. Where can people go to learn more about you and your book and your work?
Great. Well, at the moment, I'm most active on Twitter. So my handle is CR Pakaluk on Twitter. I'm eventually going to put my toe into Instagram, but I'm going to wait till I have a couple of nice young ladies to help me with that. So I can't send you to Instagram yet. And then I have a website that's just being built. So it's catherine.pakaluk.com. So
thank you so much. And everyone, thank you for tuning in. We will see you next time on the Fearless Future podcast.
Thank you, Dr.